History as it happens, May 16th, 2025. India and Pakistan's forever war.
India and Pakistan are once again on the brink of all-out war.
The whole world has heard Pakistan's Defense Minister Khwaja Asif admitting and confessing Pakistan's history of supporting, training and funding terrorist organizations.
Pakistan has accused India of igniting an inferno in the region by killing at least 26 people in a series of missile strikes and gunfire.
Those strikes came after Islamabad accused New Delhi of sending a wave of missiles towards 3 Pakistani air bases.
What began as a retaliatory strike by India in response to the Pahalgam terror attack has spiraled into an undeclared war marked
Let's rewind to 1947.
In October 1947, events took a grave turn.
From bloody partition in 1947 to today, India and Pakistan have fought over Kashmir, where many of its people prefer to be governed by neither side. It is one of the world's longest-running, most dangerous conflicts, as both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, and a harrowing reminder of why some conflicts seem impossible to end. Why? That's next, as we report history as it happens. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Strictly speaking, as a Muslim-majority area, Kashmir should have gone to Pakistan at independence and partition in 1947. But Kashmir was not directly British-ruled. It was an autonomous princedom. And the Maharaja, put in by the British, was Hindu. And so, for a crucial few weeks after independence, he hesitated. And he hesitated just too long, and Pakistan then sent in armed volunteers to overthrow him.
August 1947.
The rains come to India. It's the monsoon season. Fields are flooded, rivers overflow their banks. And all the time, the bloodshed goes on. As the new dominions of Pakistan and India take over their own affairs, communal hatred flares up in the Punjab.
After 300 years in India, the British exit.
The gate of freedom is open in India. In Karachi, capital of the newly created Muslim state of Pakistan, Lord Louis Mountbatten, last Viceroy of India, arrives to take part in the official...
What followed was a horrific bloodletting as massive populations moved between two newly independent states, forever remembered by a single word: partition.
1 million displaced persons. Independence has not yet brought them peace. Rejoicing turned quickly into horror and mourning. Throughout this vast land, Hindus and Muslims seek safety in new surroundings. Peace-loving people, theirs is the real tragedy. The fortunate few flee in army transports or in buses.
Here is historian William Dalrymple writing for The New Yorker. Across the Indian subcontinent, communities that had coexisted for almost a millennium attacked each other in a terrifying outbreak of sectarian violence, with Hindus and Sikhs on one side and Muslims on the other. A mutual genocide as unexpected as it was unprecedented.
Civil war has so far brought death to more than 50,000 people. In the trail of murder and arson come the refugees. Their suffering is the new tragedy of India.
In Punjab and Bengal, provinces abutting India's borders with West and East Pakistan respectively, the carnage was especially intense, with massacres, arson, forced conversions, mass abductions, and savage sexual violence. Some 75,000 women were raped, and many of them were then disfigured or dismembered.
So India, with over 380 million people and 100 creeds, now has 2 flags flying. One of the Earth's ancient civilizations, her future is beset with strife, but her people are free.
And then in October 1947, India and Pakistan clashed over contested territory above the northern tip of India, known for its beautiful mountain peaks, valleys, and lakes. Who started it is still bitterly disputed today. You see, after partition, the princely ruler of Kashmir, the Maharaja Hari Singh, was able to choose which new state to join. He was a Hindu, most of the population was Muslim. He couldn't decide, so the Maharaja instead signed an interim standstill agreement to keep up links with Pakistan without alienating India. But this tenuous arrangement did not last. That same month, Pakistani tribesmen invaded Kashmir. The Maharaja called India for help and signed the Instrument of Accession, temporarily joining India, pending a vote on its permanent status, a vote we all know that never took place. To this day, both sides disagree over whether the instrument of accession or the entry of Indian troops came first. And we will discuss the origins of one of the world's most intractable conflicts with our guest in a moment, Anatol Lieven, who's been covering Kashmir for 38 years. India and Pakistan have fought 3 wars over the territory, including this first one, which ended in a UN-brokered ceasefire in 1949. The second war broke out in 1965.
This was the last gunfire of the brief war between India and Pakistan. Indian reinforcements were moving up as the ceasefire was negotiated, putting an end to the conflict that has cost 5,000 lives. As this report comes from the Indian side, it shows Ambala, whose military hospital was bombed by Pakistani...
This war also failed to resolve anything. And in 1972, India and Pakistan formalized the original UN ceasefire line, now the line of control in the Simla Agreement, but this did not bring peace either. In fact, violence grew worse with a ferocious insurgency from the late 1980s.
We want complete independence both from India and Pakistan. Inshallah, we will achieve our goal within no time.
Just hours later, he and 20 others were dead after a 2-hour dawn gun battle with Indian forces. The army claimed the separatists tried to retake the mosque.
According to a New York Times report filed in 1999, after a decade of insurgency, Jammu and Kashmir, while never happily a part of India, nevertheless lived in relative peace until the rebellion. Statewide, between January 1st, 1990 and July 15th, 1999, the state police recorded 7,922 attacks with explosives, 3,500 abductions, and 619 rocket attacks. The years 1993 to 96 were the worst.
3 days after Muslim militants ended their occupation of Kashmir's holiest Islamic shrine, Indian security forces maintained a tight cordon around it.
Fast forward to April 2025.
On the brink of an all-out war, after 26 people, most of them tourists, were killed in the Indian-held part of Kashmir, tensions are rising. India pointing fingers at Pakistan for the deadly attack, where rebels stormed...
One of the worst terror attacks on Indian civilians in decades. India said Pakistan, because of its history backing Kashmiri militants, was involved in the massacre.
Acts of terrorism are criminal and unjustifiable, regardless of their motivation, wherever, whenever, and by whomever committed.
Pakistan denied it. India retaliated on May 7, launching missiles deep into Pakistani territory and sparking a frightening confrontation that lasted 4 days before the Trump administration pushed the 2 nuclear-armed countries to accept a ceasefire. So, 78 years after partition, India and Pakistan continue to spill blood over Kashmir. There's been almost no progress in decades toward resolving this territorial dispute, steeped in historical grievances and sectarian divisions. Why? Anatol Lieven is director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft here in Washington. Anatol Lieven, welcome back.
Hi.
My listeners will remember you as a regular expert on this podcast discussing Russia, Ukraine. But a few years ago, you came on here to talk about your experience covering the anti-Soviet jihad in the late 1980s in Afghanistan. And you also have extensive experience as a journalist many years ago covering the India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved in that and when you were there in the Kashmir.
I was a student in India after going to university. I spent a year there as a student. Then I returned there as a freelance journalist in the mid-80s. Then a little later, the London Times made me their correspondent in Pakistan. Well, their stringer. I wasn't really a full correspondent. So I was in Pakistan for 2 years. And while I was there, I was also covering the Afghan war. So I made 6 journeys with the Afghan Mujahideen. And then after the Soviets withdrew in 1989, some of us got visas to go in and visit Kabul and Herat and Mazar on the government, the communist side. So I saw a bit of the other side of the war as well. When 9/11 happened, I was here in Washington at the Carnegie Endowment, and I was supposed to be working on the former Soviet Union then, but I was the only person in the building who had lived and worked in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So, of course, I volunteered and I went back to Pakistan the week after 9/11. I went back to Afghanistan after the Taliban fell. Thereafter, for the best part of 15 years, I was mostly working on that area. I made several journeys to Afghanistan, spent a lot of time in Pakistan, and wrote a book on the Pakistani state and political power called A Hard Country.
And in the late 1980s is when the insurgency in Kashmir begins.
That's right. Even then, much more later, we were looking at the relationship between the Pakistani army and the intelligence service and radical Islamist groups. Now, at that stage, of course, with the full encouragement of the West, Pakistan was sending those Pakistani volunteers to fight in Afghanistan. When the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, they were redirected to fight against India in Kashmir.
That's right.
And it's really out of that comes the present crisis in its origins. Not, I should say, that the crisis in Kashmir, or the latest one, because there have been a whole series since independence in 1947, it didn't actually begin with Pakistan. It began with local unrest against interference by the Indian centre and dismissal of the elected government in Kashmir. Then, of course, the Pakistanis jumped in and supported these jihadi groups fighting against India.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. That is a theme throughout this story. Pakistani support for militants or terrorist groups or jihadists. And time and again, these militant groups cause problems for Pakistan itself, not just the people that they're fighting. So yes, there is an India-administered Kashmir and a Pakistan-administered Kashmir. There's also a small part controlled by China. I want everyone to open up a tab on their computer or on their phone. Look at a map of this region as you're listening to this conversation, because it is important. India controls about 2/3 of Kashmir, Pakistan about 1/3. But Anatol, most of the population is Muslim, right? And that's always been the case.
Yes, that is the case. That's at the root of the whole problem, both internal, Kashmir is the only Indian Muslim majority state, but also between India and Pakistan. Strictly speaking, as a Muslim majority area, Kashmir should have gone to Pakistan at independence and partition in 1947. But Kashmir was not directly British ruled. It was an autonomous princedom.
The Maharaja.
And the Maharaja, put in by the British, was Hindu. And so for a crucial few weeks after independence, he hesitated. And he hesitated just too long, and Pakistan then sent in armed volunteers to overthrow him. The Indian army intervened in response and managed to keep hold of most of the valley of Kashmir.
Yeah, and here we are 78 years later.
Well, yes.
Before we get to October 1947, which is the period you're discussing, the initial clash over Kashmir, let's just back up to August 1947, partition. Preparing to speak to you, I read a number of articles, and one by William Dalrymple in the New Yorker was really good. I'll share a link to that in my weekly newsletter about what partition was and what it still means today. I was trying to think if there's an equivalent in the American experience, and there really isn't. Maybe the American Civil War. But comparisons aside, what happened during partition, the scale, the velocity, and the sheer unexpected ferocity of the violence. The wounds of partition are still open, are they not?
Well, I mean, if you compare it to the American Civil War, it's rather as if, the South had won and had broken away. And you then had a long, frozen, sometimes unfrozen conflict over who Missouri belonged to. A little like the Civil War in Missouri, Quantrill's raiders and the insurgency and counterinsurgency there, which was the one part of the Civil War where you had mass atrocities against civilians on both sides, both by the Confederate guerrillas and by the Union forces. But the other aspect of partition, of course, which thank God you didn't see in the American Civil War, was local populations turning on each other, neighbors massacring each other, and huge numbers of people being driven out in both directions, Muslims out of Indian Punjab into Pakistan and Hindus and Sikhs from Pakistan into India.
15 million in total were uprooted.
Yes, 15 million. And somewhere, well, the figures vary and nobody did an exact count, but estimates vary from 300,000 to 1 million dead
Yes.
The vast majority of them just ordinary civilians, women and children. As I say, the closest you'd find to that in American history would be the Trail of Tears.
Nisid Hajari has a book out called Midnight's Furies, or he had a book out, that says, gangs of killers set whole villages aflame, hacking to death men and children and the aged, while carrying off young women to be raped. Some British soldiers and journalists who had witnessed the Nazi death camps claim partition's brutalities were worse. Pregnant women had their breasts cut off and babies hacked out of their bellies. Infants were found literally roasted on spits. What accounts for this, Anatol? Because prior to partition under British rule, Hindus and Muslims lived side by side.
Well, they lived side by side, but by no means always happily. There were, as there have been since partition, fairly regular, what's called in the subcontinent, communal riots, in which local populations would have a go at each other. The difference was that both before partition and since in India, this was localized, and the British Army or the Indian Army would step in eventually and control things, whereas in 1947 this extended across the whole of a province of Punjab and much of Bengal as well, and whole cities like Lahore were engulfed by it. It should be said, though, I mean, in marked contrast, of course, to the Jewish Holocaust, this was equally true of both sides. I mean, both Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs all committed dreadful atrocities.
It was like a mutual genocide, it's been described as.
Yes, and not actually so surprising. Under British rule, the government of Punjab was made up of wealthy landowners and businessmen from all three communities. It's called the Unionist Party. Its second last prime minister is a Muslim, Sir Sikandar Hayat Khan. And he was desperately trying to keep Punjab together and prevent partition. And his British secretary, assistant, said to him on one occasion, look, sir, forgive me, but it seems to me that it's just going to be impossible to get communities to work together in the long run. I mean, in the end, wouldn't it be better just to agree on partition? And Sir Sikandar replied, I never want to hear you say that again. You know this country. If we draw a line between a Muslim majority state on one side and a Hindu majority state on the other, all the Muslims on one side of the line and all the Hindus on the other will have their balls cut off. Well, not all of them did, but a fair number did.
It seems that partition was a catastrophic mistake.
Well,
or maybe the way the British went about doing it.
You see, a mistake. I mean, there were endless mistakes leading up to partition. Probably the biggest of all was the Indian elections under British rule in 1938, at which there were actually elections for provincial governments across India. Before the elections, the Indian National Congress, which ruled India for decades after independence under Jawaharlal Nehru and his daughter Indira, before those elections in 1938, they made an agreement with the Muslim League, representing the Muslim, or most of the Muslim minority, that after the elections, they would form the government together so as to reassure the Muslim population, and also because Congress thought that without that, it probably wouldn't win a majority. Well, as it turned out, to their own surprise, Congress won a large majority and then reneged on its agreement with the Muslim League and said, oh, terribly sorry, we've won, no more agreement, no ministries for you. Well, of course, that gave the Muslims the feeling that in an independent Hindu majority India, they would be a helpless minority. And they knew, of course, they knew the deep hostility of large parts of the Hindu population. There were other factors as well. Muslim power and wealth in India, for a whole set of historical reasons I won't go into, or at least the elites, were heavily dominated by landowners. And the National Congress was committed to land reform. So, of course, the Muslim elites saw themselves as facing dispossession, which is what happened to them after independence. But then you see, in 1946, the British did manage. I mean, the British bear their share of historical responsibility for, dividing Muslims and Hindus under British rule. But towards the end, the British were actually very anxious to try to hold the country together and prevent a catastrophe. And in 1946, they stitched together an agreement, the Cabinet Mission Plan, whereby India would be not a federation, but a confederation. and most power would remain with the provinces. So it wouldn't be the Indian Union, it would be the Indian Confederation. And that meant, of course, that Muslims in the Muslim majority provinces would be able to protect themselves against the centre. But also, of course, if you had a situation where Parliament was made up like the American Senate, on the basis of equal representation of states rather than the House of Representatives of population, the Muslims would have a firm blocking vote in Delhi. Nehru, the leader of the Congress, together with Gandhi, agreed to that. And then, under pressure from his own hardliners, the next day he gave a press conference at which he said, I said that, to get independence, but actually after independence, the Indian National Congress is not bound to respect that. That was the moment when the Muslim League actually went for partition and gave up hope of keeping India together.
Well, that's an important point. So we're talking about political, economic, religious causes here, but it's still hard to explain, and I guess this goes for any kind of civil war, genocide of this nature, the ferocity of the violence and the atrocities that took place. So we'll return now to October of 1947. As you mentioned before, the Maharaja Hari Singh, he had an option, he had a choice after partition to join either Pakistan or India. His area, Kashmir, was majority Muslim. He was a Hindu, so he delays.
On the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, delaying its decision about accession to either the dominion of India or Pakistan, freebooters from the northwest and Punjab invaded the state with the connivance and material support of the Pakistan government to force accession by the sword.
He signed something called a standstill agreement to maintain some links with the newly independent Pakistan. Pakistanis lose patience with this. They go into Kashmir to try to settle things, and that's when the Maharaja calls India for help. He signed something called an accession agreement to join India, with the idea that there would be a public vote to have a permanent status for Kashmir. The people would decide India or Pakistan. But in the meantime, a war breaks out and there is never a vote. And to this day, Anatol, there is a dispute over whether the Maharaja signed the accession agreement first or if Indian troops invaded Kashmir first. Because the Pakistanis say the Indians invaded first, nullifying their previous agreement with the Maharaja. Where do you stand on this? Is there an answer here?
Well, I think on the one hand, it was pretty obvious that the Maharaja was going to try and go with India and was going to try and bring in Indian troops, because it's quite clear there was no future for a Hindu Maharaja in Pakistan, whereas he could hope, although in the end the Indians, of course, abolished the princely states, that there would be a future for him in India. But the first shots, well, actually, it depends on how you calculate it. The first shots in 1947 did begin with Pashtun raiders from the frontier, but undoubtedly backed by Pakistan, invading Kashmir. And the Indian army came in response to that. But, Kashmir had not been by no means totally peaceful until then, because there had been numerous protests against the Maharaja's rule through the 20s and 30s, which the Maharaja's Hindu troops had put down with considerable violence. It's one of these issues. It's a little bit like Northern Ireland, and nobody is ever going to be able to say where all morality or legality or righteousness lies.
Yeah, the correct answer to the question, who started it, is both.
Yeah.
So,
or where do you begin? Which year do you go back to?
Yeah. So it has been an intractable conflict, an interminable dispute over this that has had some really intense moments, including earlier this month. We will get to that. There have been 3 wars over Kashmir. The initial one in 1947, a UN-brokered ceasefire ended that. 1965, and then again in 1999. But is it right to say that there's been really no progress at all in settling this? The so-called Simla line, the line of control that was established in 1972, that's the same line today as it was in 72.
Yes, with only one exception. Possibly the most fatuous war in the entire world. Well, constant low-level battle over the Siachen Glacier, because when the line of control was drawn, nobody bothered to draw it across the glacier because nobody thought, what's the point? But of course, then you got, and once again, both sides would differ on this, who started it first. You got the two sides establishing positions on this great chunk of ice. You got ridiculous statements from both sides. I remember when all this began in the 80s, I remember there was a declaration by an Indian general that the Siachen Glacier is India's gateway to Central Asia. Well, it is a bit like trying to get out of your door after several tons of ice have been dumped in front of it. And thousands of troops over the years have died on the Siachen Glacier. The overwhelming, some have been shot, but the overwhelming majority on both sides, of course, of frostbite or avalanches. One addition, which is of some relevance to other conflicts, including the whole question now of the partition of Ukraine. The United States has never legally recognized Indian sovereignty over Kashmir, nor of Pakistani sovereignty over the Pakistani bit of Kashmir. Of course, nobody now has raised this issue by the US government for many, many decades now. But strictly speaking, the United States remains neutral on this and does not recognize Indian or Pakistani sovereignty.
And do Pakistan and India both claim the entire territory for themselves, or would one be willing to just take half or 2/3 of it? I guess my question is there a way to split this down the middle, or does both Pakistan and India want the entire thing?
Publicly and officially, they both claim the entire thing. In practice, though, the Indians would be happy if you could freeze the present line permanently, because above all, they got the lion's share of Kashmir. But also the last thing that, certainly Narendra Modi wants is more discontented Muslims in India. Pakistan, on the other hand, really does want the lot, because it regards this as, with some reason, as ancient Muslim majority territory. Incidentally, you mentioned there's another slice, although almost entirely uninhabited, of land which the Chinese basically took when nobody noticed. And there's also a part of Indian Kashmir called Leh, which is Tibetan Buddhist, and another part of Kashmir which is Jammu, which actually remains majority Hindu. So it's not totally clear-cut.
Yeah, I know I'm bouncing around the chronology here. I want to go back to the 1980s and 1990s, but why today? Why today do both of these countries still want this piece of land? Why is Kashmir so important? Is it because they've simply been fighting over it for 78 years, so neither side wants to give in? Or is there some kind of religious significance to the land?
It's mostly just national pride by now. And on the Pakistani side, admittedly, the feeling, not without reason, that a majority of the population of Kashmir would like to go to Pakistan and has been pretty severely oppressed by India. But it's one of these things, I think India would be stronger, certainly more peaceful, less troubled by the threat of war if it would actually allow a referendum. Because, although, you'd still have to partition Kashmir, because the Hindu areas would certainly want to stay with India, obviously. And then there's the question of what to do with the Tibetan area. But, look, there are so many of these ridiculous cases. Britain went to war for the Falklands Islands.
Yes.
1,200 people and 1 million sheep and penguins. Russia could sell the Kuril Islands to Japan for an enormous sum, and these, to put it mildly, are not the historic territory of Russia, but refuses to do so because, you get into this business of the sacred soil. China would risk nuclear annihilation to prevent the independence of Taiwan.
People do not go to war for rational reasons, and even when it makes no sense to continue fighting over a significant, in this case, a significant piece of land. Kashmir is not a small strip of land. It still boggles the mind. So back to the 1980s there, because you mentioned how many of the Muslims in Kashmir may want to live in Pakistan or go with Pakistan today. Total population about 22 million. 15 million of that population lives in the India-administered part. Most of the rest lives in the two Pakistan-administered parts of Kashmir. We also established that India controls about 2/3 of the territory. Most of the people are Muslim. However, there's an independence sentiment, if not an independence movement there, right? This goes back to the 1980s when the insurgency begins. It's a local insurgency, right, of people wanting to break away from both
Yeah, well, yes, indeed. And of course, that is one thing that both India and Pakistan will not allow to happen. And yes, I mean, the initial protests against India in the 1980s were, heavily coloured by pro-independence sentiment. And it's impossible to say for sure. But, it's very often suggested that if you had a completely free vote on both sides, a large majority would go for independence. What then happened, as I say, in the 1990s is that with Pakistani encouragement, these Islamist jihadi groups jumped in and started this guerrilla and terrorist war against India. And, well, I mean, of course, they were representing Pakistan in one sense and were certainly being armed and supported by Pakistan. But their agenda was never exactly that of Pakistan, because their whole idea was to do this as part of an international jihad for fundamentalist Islam. And of course, after 9/11, many of these very same groups launched a rebellion within Pakistan against Pakistan in alliance with the Afghan Taliban, because they were infuriated with the US invasion of Afghanistan. And also, of course, as I say, 12 years previously, they'd been fighting, with the Afghans against Soviet occupation. And so many of them went to fight for the Taliban, but others, as I say, rebelled against Pakistan. And in the resulting civil war in Pakistan, actually far more Pakistanis died than Indian soldiers and police have died in Kashmir. So, I mean, the Pakistanis did contribute to a real Frankenstein's monster there.
Yeah, the Pakistani Taliban. I remember that some years ago. They got so strong that the Pakistani army was having trouble putting them down. So there have been 3 wars, if you want to call them major wars, over Kashmir. These were really brief wars, but they're still rather destructive. In between the wars, there's been, as you've been saying, terrible violence. More people have died in this ongoing conflict in between these 3 wars than in the wars themselves. I have an article here by Barry Birack in the New York Times from 1999 called The Vale of Tears. He says the rebellion itself began 10 years ago, so that would be 1989. Weapons flooded in. Tourists scurried out. At first, the insurgency was homegrown. Kashmiri youth shouting freedom became guerrillas trying to send India packing with a few well-placed bombs and high-profile kidnappings. Shopkeepers gave them cash, mothers made them sandwiches. To New Delhi, this was a threat to its nationhood. To Islamabad, an opportunity to wage a war by proxy. India has since tried to stamp out the revolt with all the fury of an enraged elephant, says the article, while Pakistan has tried to provoke the uprising further and arm it and bend it to its will. A common complaint in Kashmir is that India and Pakistan seem pitted against each other in a fight to the death of the last Kashmiri. Let's fast forward 25 years. Do Kashmiris still want independence?
Look, I haven't been back to Indian Kashmir for many, many years. Everything that one hears and reads suggests yes. But of course, once again, the Muslim majority of Indian Kashmir, not the Hindus, and I would imagine not the Buddhists either. But yes, I mean, neither side has paid any attention to the wishes or the well-being of the Kashmiris.
This story isn't entirely depressing and sad. After 2003, 2004, there were efforts at peace, but then some violent incident would happen. Dozens of people, if not more than that, killed in terrorist attacks. There was the Mumbai killing or the Mumbai incident in 2008 that broke off peace talks. But there really hasn't been anything substantive in recent years at all. Do you want to briefly tell us what you made of all those attempts in the early aughts?
Somewhat, I wouldn't say paradoxically, but paradoxically for people who believe in, democratic peace theory, the guy who really pushed this furthest was the military dictator of Pakistan, General Musharraf. And he, it seems, was prepared to accept a peace deal, something along the lines of Northern Ireland, whereby the line of control would be recognized as an international frontier. You would have demilitarization by both sides, and you would have freedom of movement across this line of control. Now, the thing is, the Indians had some reason to be wary of this because, of course, they were afraid that at that point, if they demilitarized the line of control and withdrew their troops, then at some point, jihadis would once again flood across the border and try to conquer Kashmir. But of course, it was also politics. The Indian government could not bring itself to defy its domestic critics by even initialing this. And then, of course, you would have to have all sorts of, it'd have to be a long process of confidence building measures. And then soon after that, Musharraf was overthrown in Pakistan, largely because of fury at his help to America in the war on terror. And since then, no Pakistani government has been strong enough to try to do this, even if it wanted to. On the Indian side, there has been a growing conviction that basically the war in Kashmir was won, the insurgency was ended. Pakistan is now so much weaker than India. Pakistan had largely crushed its own jihadists because they had revolted against the Pakistani state. And therefore, India didn't need to do anything. Or rather, more than that, the BJP government of Narendra Modi actually moved to abolish Kashmir's enhanced autonomy under the constitution. And so for several years, indeed, nothing much did happen in Indian Kashmir. But of course, then it did.
Yes. Earlier this month, relative peace in the previous decade shattered. But even so, in 2016, 19 Indian soldiers were killed in Uri. India then launched surgical strikes in retaliation across the line of control. 2019, the Pulwama bombing left more than 40 Indian paramilitary personnel dead, prompted Indian airstrikes deep into Balakot, the first such action inside Pakistan since 1971. And there was a ceasefire agreed to in 2003 because there had been a war in 1999. Modi took power in 2014. He wanted to take a hard line on Pakistan, but was interested in holding peace talks. I mean, this is a very complicated story. In the final analysis, nothing was resolved here. And as you say, Anatol, it seemed like the situation was relatively calm until it wasn't. So earlier this month, or I should say last month, there was a terrorist attack in Kashmir. About 24 Hindu tourists were massacred. India said this is Pakistan once again backing militant groups, and they're responsible for this.
And exposes Pakistan as a rogue state, fueling global terrorism and destabilizing the region. The world can no longer turn a blind eye. I have nothing further to add. Thank you.
Pakistan denied it. What do you make of that?
Well, the answer is I don't know. And that's what makes these issues so complicated. Because, look, undoubtedly in the past, there was strong and critical Pakistani military support for these jihadis. Now, since Musharraf, certainly since, Mumbai brought the two countries to the edge of war, and since the jihadis revolted in Pakistan itself, that support has gone down a great deal, and largely in consequence, there is far, far less violence and terrorism in Kashmir today than there was 20 years ago or in the 1990s. Whether the Pakistanis were involved, if you see what I mean, they don't have to be, because this massacre was carried out by a few men with Kalashnikovs. Well, Pakistan is flooded with Kalashnikovs. In many parts of the country, politicians of all parties, have bodyguards heavily armed. You don't have to assume a Pakistani role in this. On the other hand, there is another element which is relatively new and could have motivated. Once again, this is speculation on my part, but the thing is, in recent years, there's been an increasingly violent insurgency within Pakistan, yet another insurgency, quite a different one, by Baloch nationalists fighting for independence from Pakistan. They have also been disrupting the Pakistani-Chinese relationship by killing Chinese engineers working on this economic corridor from China to Gwadar, in the port of Gwadar in Baluchistan. And a few weeks before this massacre in Kashmir, these Baloch insurgents carried off their biggest coup for a long time by seizing a train and taking hundreds of passengers hostage. Now, the Pakistanis have always alleged that India is supporting and arming the Baloch. They haven't produced much evidence for this, though once they did manage to capture somebody who appears to have been an Indian military agent there. But certainly that is what the Pakistanis believe. And so I can imagine, but as I say, this is speculation on my part, that the Pakistani intelligence service or somebody within it said, look, we've let the Indians get away with too much. Let's show them that we can still do the same in return. That, I think, is a possibility.
So per the New York Times, it was on April 22nd, 26 people shot and killed during a terrorist attack in the Bizaran Valley. A group calling itself the Resistance Front emerged on social media to take responsibility. As you said, it was just a handful of men with AK-47s. Indian officials privately say the group is a proxy for Lashkar-i-Taiba, a terrorist organization based in Pakistan. They were also involved in the insurgency that eased around 2002. I mentioned that a ceasefire had been agreed in 2003. Pakistan banned Lashkar and Jaish-e-Mohammed, another major militant group, although Lashkar continued to operate under aliases. What a mess. So, something I haven't mentioned here, I'm such a great interviewer, Anatol Lieven, is that both of these countries have nuclear weapons. So as I watch this 4-day war, if you want to call it that, unfold on TV, back and forth across the border, deep into each other's countries, not just in Kashmir, I was worried, and maybe this was hysterical at the moment, but I was worried about nuclear conflict because you just never know. What are your thoughts on that as we wrap up here? And how this is a lingering, simmering, dangerous conflict that won't be resolved anytime soon, but the countries have nuclear weapons.
Well, that is indeed the terrifying threat. And what makes it, well, two things make it worse. One is that the capitals are so close to each other that you don't even have the warning time, that you have between Russia and America. Strike and response will be almost instantaneous. Now, both sides know that. And, there has always been a counter argument that because they know that, actually this is a source of restraint. I mean, I'm pretty sure that if Pakistan didn't have nuclear weapons, India would have invaded Pakistan and you would have had a much, much bigger conventional war. But of course, then Pakistan would escalate to nuclear weapons. But there is something else. And I mean, this is something which the international community really, really needs to drill into both sides. Because both sides say, look, you have nuclear weapons. Why shouldn't we have nuclear weapons? We have security concerns. You have security concerns. Yes, but for that reason, the Soviet Union did not sponsor insurgency in the United States. Or in Western Europe. And the United States did not sponsor during the Cold War insurgency in Eastern Europe because it was just too damn dangerous. Nuclear responsibility prohibited that. That, of course, is one of the great dangers of the Ukraine war, that you get much closer to a proxy war in Europe. Elsewhere in the world, of course, both sides supported proxy wars against each other, US against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, Soviet Union against us in Vietnam. But the calculation was nobody cares enough about that to risk nuclear war. Whereas if you do it in Europe, let alone in North America, but that's not going to happen, thank God, then you do just get much closer to nuclear annihilation.
Well,
that's what you need to remind them of.
Yeah, is Kashmir important enough to have a nuclear war over? I mean, to you and I, of course not, but we're not Indian and Pakistan.
Well, I mean, of course, that's not the way it would go.
Yeah, of course.
You wouldn't begin with a nuclear strike, but something that actually worries me, and I think worries the Pakistanis much more than Indian missile strikes, is this Indian threat to dam the waters of the Indus River, which they can do, which they've never done in the past, because this would strangle Pakistan. Pakistani agriculture is critically dependent on this water from the Himalayas. Pakistan has repeatedly described that threat as a threat of war to which Pakistan would respond with military means, including quite possibly the threat of nuclear war. It's to be hoped that India recognizes this because, of course, what the Pakistanis are afraid of is that it will be done in stages, so there will never be a moment when they can actually retaliate en masse, but that the end result will be the same. That's something, well, I mean, that's also a terrifying danger, simply because, of course, in future, India may be shorter and shorter of water and just think, yeah, we need the water.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, preeminent military historian Antony Beevor returns to the podcast. He's going to talk about unsettled legacies of the Second World War and Vladimir Putin's uses and abuses of Soviet memory and its victory over the Nazis 80 years ago this month. That's next as we report history as it happens. New episodes every Tuesday and Friday. Sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. It'll land in your inbox every Friday.